Well, I suppose it's time to get started. Due to various technical issues, I'm unable to determine the quality of my audio here, so if anything goes wrong, I'll have to depend on y'all in the chat to make sure that, well, nothing's going wrong. So, first off, we're going to begin with a bit of an overview on the annotations I'll be making while I'm reading. So first of all, essentially we'll be following this guide here. Besides this inside front cover part, which says write up a character list with character descriptions and relationships with other characters, we're going to be doing that on a separate piece of paper, which I might or might not include in the stream. The signposts we'll get to. I've got a page for that. The signposts are essentially various events that happen as the story progresses. Bottom margins, I'll circle any unfamiliar words or words that are rarely seen and tell you all the definitions. And top margins will be for plot notes, a quick few words or phrases which summarize what happens here. Highlighting may happen throughout. I'm not a big highlighter fan, but I've got one right here, so we'll see how much I use it. And then brackets too, as well. So, moving on here we have the signposts. I'll be noting down. Contrasts and contradictions. A sharp contrast between what we would expect and what we observe the character doing. Behavior contradicts previous behavior or well-established patterns. Also contrast between characters or situations. So clues would be a character behaves or thinks in a way we don't expect, or an element of a setting is something we would not expect. This signpost is probably related to irony, is what I'm thinking right now. What literary element it helps us understand. Character development, internal conflict theme, and relationship between setting and plot. Anchor questions, some questions they'd like us to ask. Why would the character act or feel this way? How do the contrasts between characters help us understand them? And how might contrasts between situations help us predict plot or conflict? Our second signpost is going to be again and again, or related to a motif. Events, images, or particular words that recur over a portion of the novel. So clues, a word is repeated, sometimes used in an odd way over and over in the story, or an image reappears several times during the course of the book. I'd probably expand that to include an idea that reappears multiple times in rapid succession. This will help us understand plot, setting, symbolism, theme, character development, and conflict. Anchor questions, we've only got one for this one and the rest of them. Why might the author bring this up again and again? So our next signpost is a memory moment, a recollection by a character that interrupts the forward progress of the story. The ongoing flow of the clues, being the ongoing flow of the narrative, is interrupted by a memory that comes to the character, often taking several paragraphs to recount before we are returned to events of the present moment. So essentially just a flashback. It'll help us understand character development, plot, theme, and relationship between character and plot. Anchor questions, why do we have this flashback here? Our next is an aha moment. A character's realization or something that shifts his actions or understanding of himself, others, or the world around him. Otherwise known as an epiphany. Phrases usually expressing suddenness, like "suddenly I understood." It came to me in a flash that the realization hit me like a lightning bolt, or in an instant I knew. This will help us understand character development, internal conflict, and plot. Anchor questions, how might this change things? Our next one is tough questions. Questions a character raises that reveal his or her internal struggles. So clues would be phrases expressing serious doubt or confusion. What could I possibly do to? I couldn't imagine how I could cope with. How could I ever understand why she? Or never had I been never had I been so confused about. The literary elements it'll help us understand include internal conflict, theme, and character development. And a question to ask would be, what does this question make me wonder about? And our final signpost out of the 6 are words of the wiser. The advice or insight of a wiser character, usually older, offers about life to the main character. Some clues are that the main character and another are usually off by themselves in a quiet, serious moment, and the wiser figure shares his wisdom or advice in an effort to help the main character with a problem or a decision. It'll help us understand theme, internal conflict, and relationship between character and plot. And our question would be, what is the life lesson? Got to include an is there, and how might it affect the character? And now, I should have been writing on this throughout, but I'll put in my notes here, so a motif for again and again, because that's really what we're looking for, our motifs. A memory moment, it's essentially a flashback. And an aha moment is also known as an epiphany. And there, I think I spelled that right this time. Of course, I'll grammar not see that is. Okay, and then that should be it for the signposts. And now here, I've got a guide on how to do close reading. It's a bit long, so I don't think I'll read it all. But essentially, what it's telling us to do is to read with a pencil in hand and annotate the text. Look for patterns in the things you've noticed about the text, repetitions, contradictions, similarities. So basically what we're looking out for with the signpost. And ask questions about the patterns you've noticed, especially how and why. And so that's essentially what we'll be doing as we read through a separate piece. Now, before we get on with the with an introduction to the book, I'd like to note that plagiarism is bad. Please don't copy my annotations. I shouldn't be doing anything too much, so it shouldn't be too much of a temptation, but I'd ask you to still please refrain. If this is for an assignment, of course. Otherwise, I don't really care. Copy however much you want. Now, I'll share, right now, before we start the book, I've pulled up the Wikipedia page on a separate piece, and I don't think I have it set up to share with you, but I'll just read off of it here to introduce you to the background of the book. So, according to Wikipedia, A Separate Piece is a coming-of-age novel by John Knowles, published in 1959. It's based on his earlier short story Phineas, which was published in the May 1956 issue of Cosmopolitan. It was Knowles' first published novel and became his best-known work. It is set against the backdrop of World War II, and it explores morality, patriotism, and loss of innocence through its narrator, Jean. Okay, so now beginning with the book, here's the back cover. Set at a boys' boarding school in New England during the early years of World War II, A Separate Piece is a harrowing and luminous parable of the dark side of adolescence. Jean is a lonely, introverted intellectual. Phineas is a handsome, taunting, daredevil athlete. What happens between the two friends one summer, like the war itself, vanishes the innocence of these boys and their world. A bestseller for more than 50 years, A Separate Piece is John Knowles' crowning achievement and an undisputed American classic. So reading the reviews here, a novel that made such a deep impression on me at 16 that I can still conjure the atmosphere in my 50s of yearning, infatuation mingled indistinguishably with envy and remorse, according to Lionel Shriver, author of We Need to Talk About Kevin. Well, I suppose Kevin did something. Unforgettable, a deeply moving coming-of-age story, set against the backdrop of war, that explores what it means to have a true friend and to be a true friend, how some friendships mold us, stamp us, for better or worse, on the fledgling's path to the adult world, according to M.L. Stedman, author of The Light Between Oceans. A model of restraint, deeply felt and beautifully written, according to The Observer, and a quietly vital and cleanly written novel that moves page by page towards the most interesting target, Truman Capote, author of In Cold Blood. And for a little bit about the author, John Knowles, who died in 2001, was a graduate of Phillips Exeter University Academy and Yale University, as well as a recipient of the William Faulkner Award and the Rosenthal Award of the National Institute of Arts and Letters. And we can actually, off of this back cover, we can glean a few clues here. So the Observer notes it as a model of restraint, which may serve us when we read the book later. M.L. Stedman explores what it means to have a true friend and to be a true friend, and about how some friendships affect us. So that's most likely one of the main themes that we'll need to be paying attention to. And besides that, it's introduced to us the two main characters, Jean and Phineas, who I'm sure will be formally introduced to once we begin the novel. So, to begin. Various praise for A Separate Piece, the exact same people that were on the back page. A gem of controlled eloquence, according to New York World Telegram and Sun. Artistry of a High Order, according to Saturday Review. Coming-of-age tale set in a New England boarding school, it bears immediate comparison to its better-known contemporary The Catcher in the Rye, which, by the way, I've never read, but is an altogether gentler, more quietly brilliant book. Reading this novel will feel like unearthing a forgotten gem, according to The Independent. I think it is the best written, best designed, and most moving novel I have read in many years. Beginning with a tiny incident among ordinary boys, it ends as being as deep and big as evil itself, according to Aubrey Menon. Is Knowles the successor to Salinger, for whom we have been waiting so long, according to Encounter? I presume Salinger is a famous writer. Beautifully written, great depth, according to San Francisco Chronicle, and exceptional power and distinction, according to the Times in the UK. There, if you wanted, a list of his books. This is the most well-known. John Knowles, A Separate Piece. Dedicated to Bea and Jim with gratitude and love. Chapter 1. I went back to the Devon school not long ago and found it looking oddly newer than when I was a student there 15 years before. It seemed more sedate than I remembered it, more perpendicular and straight-laced, with narrower windows and shinier woodwork, as though a coat of varnish had been put over everything for better preservation. But of course, 15 years before there had been a war going on. But of course, 15 years before, there had been a war going on. Perhaps the school wasn't as well kept up in those days. Perhaps Varnish, along with everything else, had gone to war. Excuse me for a moment while I find my notes to remind me to annotate. I should have some more notes over here. Okay. Sorry for the delay. And I'm not sure where the rest of them went. Oh well. I didn't entirely like the glossy new surface because it made the school look like a museum, and that's exactly what it was to me, and what I did not want it to be. In the deep, tacit way in which feeling becomes stronger than thought, I had always felt that the Devon School came into existence the day I entered it, and was vibrantly real while I was a student there, and then blinked out like a candle the day I left. So, telling from what we know so far from the back cover, this first chapter is most likely an introduction from the future of where the natural book is placed. So, I might actually want to mark this as a memory moment, but the flow of the narrative isn't exactly interrupted, so we'll leave it without marking and just remember that the introduction is some sort of a flashback. However, it does give us a hint over here that this part is an introduction to the setting, showing us the Devon School and telling us how back when the speaker, most likely Gideon, was there, the school wasn't as well kept up. And unfortunately, my highlighter bleeds through, so I might just stick to underlining it. So, continuing, page 10. Now, here it was, after all, preserved by some considerate hand with varnish and wax. Preserved along with it, like stale air in an unopened room, was the well-known fear which had surrounded and filled those days. So much of it that I hadn't even known it was there. Because, unfamiliar with the absence of fear and what that was like, I had not been able to identify its presence. Looking back now, across 15 years, I could see with great clarity the fear I had lived in, which must mean that in the interval I had succeeded in a very important undertaking. I must have made my escape from it. I felt fear's echo, and along with that I felt the unhinged, uncontrollable joy which had been its accompaniment, an opposite face. Joy which had broken out sometimes in those days like northern lights across black sky. There were a couple of places now which I wanted to see. Both were fearful sights, and that was why I wanted to see them. So after lunch at the Devon Inn, I walked back toward the school. It was a raw, nondescript time of year, toward the end of November, the kind of wet, self-pitying November day when every speck of dirt stands out clearly. Devon luckily had very little of such weather. The icy clamp of winter or the radiant New Hampshire summers were more characteristic of it, but this day it blew wet, moody gusts all around me. I walked along Gilman Street, the best street in town. The houses were as handsome and as unusual as I remembered. Clever modernizations of old colonial mansions, extensions in Victorian wood, capacious Greek revival temples lined the street, as impressive and just as forbidding as ever. I had rarely seen anyone go into one of them, or anyone playing on a lawn, or even an open window. Today, with their failing ivy and stripped, moaning trees, the houses looked both more elegant and more lifeless than ever. In these last few paragraphs, we can see how John Knowles, at least in my opinion, is just using the imagery of the setting to contribute a lot to the, I would say, somber mood that he's trying to get at here as the speaker, most likely Gene, once again visits his old school. Like all old good schools, Devon did not stand isolated behind walls and gates, but emerged naturally from the town which had produced it. So there was no dreaded moment of encounter as I approached it. The houses along Gilman Street began to look more defensive, which meant that I was near the school, and then more exhausted, which meant that I was in it. It was early afternoon, and the grounds and buildings were deserted, since everyone was at sports. There was nothing to distract me as I made my way across a wide yard, called the Far Common, and up to a building as red brick and balanced as the other major buildings, but with a large cupola and a bell and a clock in Latin over the doorway, the first academy building. In through swinging doors, I reached a marble foyer and stopped at the foot of a long white marble flight of stairs. Although they were old stairs, the worn moons in the middle of each step were not very deep. The marble must be unusually hard. That seemed very likely, only too likely, although with all my thought about these stairs this exceptional hardness had not occurred to me. It was surprising that I had overlooked that crucial fact. There was nothing else to notice. They, of course, were the same stairs I had walked up and down at least once every day of my Devon life. They were the same as ever. And I naturally felt older. I began at that point the emotional examination to note how far my convalescence had gone. I was taller, bigger generally, in relation to these stairs. I had more money and success and security than in the days when specters seemed to go up and down with me. Now here, we note our first large word, convalescence. From my experience, convalescence means growing up, but I will look it up just to be sure. Over here. Convalescence here. According to Google, the definition is time spent recovering from an illness or medical treatment, recuperation. I was a bit up there. Wow. Okay. Time spent recovering from an illness or medical treatment. Besides that, we just see a bunch of architecture that we probably don't care too much about, except for the fact that it contributes a bit to the mood, and the sort of feel of the school itself as sort of just a down place that isn't very nice or uplifting. Besides that, if y'all find out any words y'all want me to point out, just put them in the chat and I'll try and reach them. I can barely see the chat from where I am. I might miss them. Capacious and cupola were suggested. Cupola, as far as I know, it's just a piece of a building. A certain piece, which I am not entirely sure which is. So, Google calls a cupola a small dome, especially a small dome on a drum on top of a larger dome, adorning a roof or ceiling. So essentially, just a dome on the top, which, if we look back, so the Far Common and up to a building as red brick and balanced as the other major buildings, with a large cupola and a bell and a clock in Latin over the doorway. First Academy building. So we know that the First Academy building is balanced, made of red brick, has a large dome on the top, as well as a bell and a clock, probably within the tower, either above or below that dome. And capacious. Capacious, defined by Google as an adjective having a lot of space inside, roomy. And so, if we look back, capacious, I sort of lost where it was. Well, I suppose I lost it. Oh well. We'll know what it is if it shows up again. So, to the next page. I turned away and went back outside. The far common was still empty, and I walked alone down the wide gravel paths among those most Republican, bankerish of trees, New England elms, toward the far side of the school. I would assume that in this case, as it was written back in '59, politics were a bit different than today, with New England Republicans and Democrats, and it probably means something different than we would take it for today. But I'll leave a note there, and then we might come back to that in a later live stream. And we haven't exactly had a contrast, any signposts yet. Although, if we look back here, we note that the speaker here put a bit of thought into these steps made of marble, which was exceptionally hard. So we might want to keep an eye out on that for some reason or another. And looking back, I noted another thing. He says over here, looking back now across 15 years. So he's probably about 30-something now, if we're saying he's 15 when he was in that school. So, been a while since he's in there. And it's probably late 50s, so around when this book was written that he's coming back. So, here we go. Devon is sometimes considered the most beautiful school in New England, and even on this dismal afternoon its power was asserted. It is the beauty of small areas of order, a large yard, a group of trees, 3 similar dormitories, a circle of old houses living together in contentious harmony. You felt that an argument might begin again at any time, and in fact it had. Out of the dean's residence, a pure and authentic colonial house, there now sprouted an L with a big bare picture window. Some days the dean would probably live entirely encased in a house of glass, and be as happy as a sandpiper. Everything at Devon slowly changed and slowly harmonized with what had gone before, so it was logical to hope that since the buildings and the deans and the curriculum could achieve this, I could achieve, perhaps unknowingly already had achieved, this growth and harmony myself. Here we have another architectural word. It's probably a bit unfamiliar. L, according to Google. L means here we go. L means, according to Google, it means a former measure of length equivalent to 6 handbreadths, used mainly for textiles, locally variable but typically about 45 inches. That's the first definition. I don't think it applies there. The second definition says something that is L-shaped or that creates an L shape. North American usage is an extension of a building or a room that is at right angles to the main part. So, apparently, out of the dean's residence, they've built an addition at a right angle to the main part with a huge window. if we're looking at themes here, this might here, because Devon is sometimes considered the most beautiful school in New England, and yet over here, we note that the houses along Gilman Street began to look defensive and exhausted. But then Devon considered itself, or is considered itself, a beautiful school. I doubt it's too much to call it contrast or contradiction. I don't believe it's sharp enough, but we might want to note over here the contrast between houses and the beauty of the school. Although, we should also note that while the school is called beautiful, he also points out that you felt that an argument might begin again at any time. And so, coupled with the houses before, it sort of keeps some of the gloominess that we had. And most likely, over here, this slow change in harmonization with what had gone before, and whether the speaker has achieved that growth in harmony himself. From what I can tell so far, as this is a coming-of-age book, this probably relates to how he's observing it, how it changes and harmonizes with what had gone before. Probably it's trying to point out with the theme of growing up that as one grows up, change and harmonization to everything else happens. So it's probably dealing with Daisy. Erase. It's probably dealing with the theme of growing up. Continuing on. I would know more about that when I had seen the second place I had come to see. So I roamed on past the balanced red brick dormitories with webs of leafless ivy clinging to them, through a ramshackle salient of the town which invaded the school for 100 yards, past the solid gymnasium full of students at this hour, but silent as a monument on the outside, past the field house called the Cage. I remember now what a mystery references to the Cage had been during my first weeks at Devon. I had thought it must be a place of severe punishment. I had reached the huge open sweep of ground known as the playing fields. And I reached the huge open sweep of ground known as the playing fields. Excuse me. One thing I would note in here, the speaker notes the red brick dormitory, notes a ramshackle salient of the town which invaded the school for 100 yards. A salient in warfare along a linear front is, for example, if in one point one person controls territory which compared to the other lines in the front is farther ahead. According to Google, a salient is, in terms of military definition, it's an outward bulge in a line of military attack or defense. It can also be defined as a piece of land or a section of fortification that juts out to form an angle. And then, so we note that he uses the word salient here and the word invaded here, which both are related to warfare. So it's sort of referencing how when he was there 15 years ago, World War II was going on, and he still has those memories in his head. So, Devon was both scholarly and very athletic, so the playing fields were vast and, except at such a time of year, constantly in use. Now they reached soggily and emptily away from me. Forlorn tennis courts on the left, enormous football and soccer and lacrosse fields in the center, woods on the right, and at the far end a small river detectable from this distance by the few bare trees along its banks. It was such a gray and misty day that I could not see the other side of the river, where there was a small stadium. I started the long trudge across the fields, and had gone some distance before I paid any attention to the soft and muddy ground, which was dooming my city shoes. I didn't stop. Near the center of the fields were thin lakes of muddy water, which I had to make my way around, my unrecognizable shoes making obscene noises as I lifted them out of the mire. With nothing to block it if the wind flung wet gusts at me, at any other time I would have felt like a fool slogging through mud and rain, only to look at a tree. So, what we can probably tell is because he does look like a fool slogging through mud and rain to look at a tree, this tree is probably was important 15 years ago, emotionally. It might be one of his sites of where he met up with Phineas or hung out or any number of things that happened at that tree, or perhaps or a single event, like someone died there or something like that. We don't know yet, but we're going to keep an eye on that tree because it most likely will become very important. Tree. There we go. A little fog hung over the river, so that as I neared it, I felt myself becoming isolated from everything except the river and the few trees beside it. The wind was blowing more steadily here, and I was beginning to feel cold. I never wore a hat and had forgotten gloves. There were several trees bleakly reaching into the fog. Any one of them might have been the one I was looking for. Unbelievable that there were other trees which it looked like here. It had loomed in my memory as a huge lone spike dominating the riverbank, forbidding as an artillery piece, see, the war reference again, high as the beanstalk. Yet here was a scattered grove of trees, none of them of any particular grandeur. And again, throughout this whole chapter, we've been seeing just sort of imagery of the setting that contributes to gloomy theme in general. Gloomy mood, excuse me, not gloomy theme, gloomy mood. Moving through the soaked, coarse grass, I began to examine each one. I didn't skip anything, did I? Okay. Moving through the soaked, coarse grass, I began to examine each one closely, and finally identified the tree I was looking for by means of certain small scars rising along its trunk, and by a limb extending over the river, and another thinner limb growing near it. This was the tree, and it seemed to me standing there to resemble those men, the giants of your childhood, whom you encounter years later and find that they are not merely smaller in relation to your growth, but that they are absolutely smaller, shrunken by age. In this double demotion, the old giants have become pygmies, while you were looking the other way. The tree was not only stripped by the cold season, it seemed weary from age, enfeebled, dry. I was thankful, very thankful I had seen it. So the more things remain the same, the more they changed after all. Plus c'est la même chose, plus ça change. And I probably pronounced that terrible. Nothing endures, not a tree, not love, not even a death by violence. Changed, I headed back through the mud. I was drenched. Anybody could see it was time to come out of the rain. So here, on this page, we immediately find both another relation to the theme of growing up, and some more theme and foreshadowing. So, here we see with the theme of growing up, that as one grows up, those that seemed like giants, both shrunk in relation to one's growth, but are absolutely smaller having been shrunk by age. And then, wow, it's sort of explicit there. And then, over here, nothing endures, sort of a nihilistic theme there. Not a tree, not love, not even a death by violence. So we can tell here is most likely foreshadowing. Foreshadowing. There we go. And then, most likely, the trees, not only the trees is important, but love and a death by violence will occur later in the story. I doubt the French is too important, except for the fact that he probably learned French in school, which may be of import later. And you may note how he says, changed, I was drenched, anybody could see it was time to come in out of the rain. And how he was thankful, very thankful he had seen the tree. So this might be some type of epiphany over here, or simply realization moment, where he is changed. But we don't know for sure yet, until we get to the rest of the story and figure out what that tree means to him. And here, see this, with this break, we have a flashback, or as they like to call it, memory moment. So we'll have a flashback here. And this is probably one of those books where the whole thing is a flashback, due to, well, just for the introduction. Anyways, continuing on. The tree was tremendous, an irate, steely black steeple beside the river. I was damned if I'd climb it. The hell with it. No one but Phineas could think up such a crazy idea. He, of course, saw nothing the slightest bit intimidating about it. He wouldn't or wouldn't admit it if he did, not Phineas. And immediately we see some characterization about cautious Jean and daring Phineas. So Phineas, daring, Jean, cautious. And I really should write that better. Cautious. There we go. And we note how the tree in his younger days was an irate, steely black steeple. But up here, it was not only stripped by the cold season, it seemed weary from age, enfeebled, dry. And so, it also was one of the giants that had become pygmies while he was looking away. What I like best about this tree, he said in that voice of his, the equivalent in sound of a hypnotist's eyes, what I like is that it's such a cinch. He opened his green eyes wider and gave us his maniac look, and only the smirk on his wide mouth with its droll, slightly protruding upper lip reassured us that he wasn't completely goofy. "Is that what you like best?" I said sarcastically. I said a lot of things sarcastically that summer. That was my sarcastic summer, 1942. More characterization there with sarcasm. 1942, so we know that 15 years older over here, it's in 1957, most likely. Or 8, depending on how long this flashback takes. But "Aya," he said, this weird New England affirmative, maybe it spelled A, huh? Always made me laugh, as Finney knew, so I had to laugh, which made me feel less sarcastic and less scared. There were 3 others with us. Phineas in those days almost always moved in groups the size of a hockey team, and they stood with me looking with massed apprehension from him to the tree. Its soaring black trunk was set with rough wooden pegs leading up to a substantial limb which extended farther toward the water. Standing on this limb, you could by a prodigious effort jump far enough out into the river for safety. Prodigious, in this case, just meaning large effort. Where's that? Here we go. So we had heard, at least, the 17-year-old bunch could do it, but they had a crucial year's advantage over us. So we know he's 16, which means he's 31 previously. No upper middler, which was the name for our class in the Devon school, had ever tried. Naturally, Finney was going to be the first to try, and just as naturally he was going to inveigle others, us, into trying it with him. So Finney, we see characterization here, Finney being reckless, we would say. Finney, reckless. Maybe he'll get the whole gang into trouble later. That might lead to some unintended consequences. That's my prediction. And inveigle probably means something along the lines of drag into, according to Google. Google says to persuade someone to do something by means of deception or flattery. Okay. Actually, I'll write that down here, as that's... Here we go. Inveigle. Persuade someone to do something. By means of deception or flattery. We were not even upper middler exactly, for this was the summer session, just established to keep up with the pace of the war. We were in shaky transit that summer from the groveling status of lower middlers to the near respectability of upper middlers. Class above, seniors, draft bait, practically soldiers, rushed ahead of us toward the war. They were caught up in accelerated courses and first aid programs and a physical hardening regimen, which included jumping from the street. We were still calmly, numbly reading Virgil and playing tag in the river farther downstream, until Finney fell to the tree. So we see here that actually they're probably not even 16 in this case. They're in the summer, transitioning from essentially sophomores to juniors, and that this school, at this point in the war, just directly feeds into it with new recruits. So, we stood looking up at it, 4 looks of consternation, another word there. Google here says feelings of anxiety or dismay. Typically it's something unexpected. So 4 looks of consternation, 1 of excitement. Do you want to go first? Finney asked. Finney asked us rhetorically. So most likely Finney's is the one of excitement. We just looked quietly back at him. and so he began taking off his clothes, stripping down to his underpants. For such an extraordinary athlete, even as a lower middler, Phineas had been the best athlete in the school. He was not spectacularly built. He was my height, 5 feet 8.5 inches. I had been claiming 5 feet 9 inches before he became my roommate, but he had said in public, with that simple, shocking self-acceptance of his, "No, you're the same height I am, 5 8.5, we're on the short side." He weighed 150 pounds, a galling 10 pounds more than I did, which flowed from his legs to torso, around shoulders to arms, and full strong neck in an uninterrupted, unemphatic unity of strength. I'm a bit confused here whether Phineas or Phineas. Oh, here we go. Finney over here, which my goodness, didn't realize until now, but Finney is most likely Finney is what's the word? Diminutive for Phineas, which I can't believe I didn't get until right now. Well, same people. He began scrambling up the wooden pegs nailed to the side of the tree. His back muscles working like a panther's. The pegs didn't seem strong enough to hold his weight. At last he stepped onto the branch which reached a little farther toward the water. Is this the one they jumped from? None of us knew. If I do it, you're all going to do it, aren't you? We didn't say anything very clearly. Well, he cried out, "Here's my contribution to the war effort." And he sprang out, fell through the tops of some lower branches, and smashed into the water. "Great," he said, bobbing instantly to the surface again, his wet hair plastered in droll bangs on his forehead. "That's the most fun I've had this week. Who's next?" I was. The tree flooded me with a sensation of alarm all the way to my tingling fingers. My head began to feel unnaturally light, and the vague rustling sounds from the nearby woods came to me as though muffled and filtered. I must have been entering a mild state of shock. Insulated by this, I took off my clothes and started to climb the pegs. I don't remember saying anything. The branch he had jumped from was slenderer than it looked from the ground, and much higher. It was impossible to walk out on it, far enough to be well over the river. I would have to spring far out or risk falling into the shallow water next to the bank. "Come on," drawled Finney from below. "Stop standing there showing off." I recognized with automatic tenseness that the view was very impressive from here. "When they torpedoed the troop ship," he shouted, "you can't stand around admiring the view. Jump." What was I doing up here anyway? Why did I let Finney talk me into stupid things like this? Was he getting some kind of hold over me? Jump! With the sensation that I was throwing my life away, I jumped into space. Some tips of branches snapped past me, and then I crashed into the water. My legs hit the soft mud on the bottom, and immediately I was on the surface being congratulated. I felt fine. So, we haven't found very many signposts here, or other notes to do. Probably because the story's just getting started. But what we're seeing in this first few pages, characterization of Phineas and Jean being very cautious, a bit fearful, Phineas daring, reckless, athletic, and most likely Jean over here is probably more of an academics guy. So, "I think that was better than Finney," said Elwyn, better known as Lepellion, who was bidding for an ally in the dispute he foresaw. "All right, pal," Finney spoke in his cordial, penetrating voice, that reverberant instrument in his chest. Well, Phineas also has a good voice, apparently. "Don't start awarding prizes until you've passed the course. The tree is waiting." Leper closed his mouth as though forever. He didn't argue or refuse. He didn't back away. He became inanimate. But the other two, Chet Douglas and Bobby Zane, were vocal enough, complaining shrilly about school regulations and the danger of stomach cramps, physical disabilities they had never mentioned before. So we notice that Elwyn over here Owen Lepellier, who's known as Leper, is probably, as far as I can tell, tries to stay on top of the social scene, I guess, or something like that. We'll have to see a bit more on him. But the other two, Chet Douglas, Bobby Zane, we see here that they're much more of secondary characters, but that they're probably some of just the normal background students. It's you, pal, Finney said to me at last. Just you and me. He and I started back across the fields, preceding the others like two sinews. We were the best of friends at that moment. You were very good, said Finney good-humoredly, once I shamed you into it. Now here we go. So I presume Chet, Bobby, and Leper just never went up and jumped. So Leper over here is probably one of those shyer than Chet and Bobby, or at least more quiet. You didn't shame anybody into anything. Oh yes, I did. I'm good for you that way. You have a tendency to back away from things otherwise. I never backed away from anything in my life, I cried, my indignation at this charge naturally stronger because it was so true. You're goofy. Phineas just walked serenely on, or rather flowed on, rolling forward in his white sneakers with such unthinking unity of movement that walk didn't describe it. And here we go again, showing Phineas as an example of unity. Here we see unity of movement. Here we see an uninterrupted, unemphatic unity of strength, which is probably going to be important later in the story, depending on what he represents and what happens. I went along beside him. Oh, well, first, another thing, with such unthinking unity of movement that walk didn't describe it. What I see here is that with such perfection of a certain thing, the simple, mundane way to describe it falls short. That could perhaps be part of the theme there, or a lesson. We don't know yet. I went along beside him across the enormous playing fields toward the gym. Underfoot, the healthy green turf was brushed with dew, and ahead of us we could see a faint green haze hanging above the grass, shot through with the twilight sun. Phineas stopped talking for once, so that now I could hear cricket noises and bird cries of dusk. A gymnasium truck gunning along an empty athletic road a quarter of a mile away. A burst of faint, isolated laughter carried to us from the back door of the gym, and then overall, cool and matriarchal, the 6 o'clock bell from the Academy building cupola, the calmest, most carrying bell toll in the world, civilized, calm, invincible, and final. And that bell will probably come to represent something as well, if I'm guessing anything. The toll sailed over the expansive tops of all the elms, the great slanting roofs and formidable chimneys of the dormitories, the narrow and brittle old housetops across the open New Hampshire sky to us coming back from the river. We'd better hurry or we'll be late for dinner, I said, breaking into what Finney called my West Point stride. Phineas didn't really dislike West Point in particular, or authority in general, but just considered authority the necessary evil against which happiness was achieved by reaction, the backboard which returned all the insults he threw at it. Well, so we see Phineas here is probably going to get in trouble with his authority at some point. Necessary evil. This is probably something. Brackets would be good here. But just considered authority the necessary evil against which happiness was achieved by reaction, the backboard which returned all the insults he threw at it. So he views authority as something to be reacted against rather than followed. My West Point stride was intolerable. Let me fix this bracket here. His right foot flashed into the middle of my fast walk, and I went pitching forward into the grass. "Get those 150 pounds off me," I shouted, because he was sitting on my back. Then he got up, patted my head genially, and moved on across the field, not deigning to glance around for my counterattack, but relying on his extrasensory ears, his ability to feel in the air someone coming on him from behind. As I sprang at him, he sidestepped easily, but I just managed to kick him as I shot past. He caught my leg, and there was a brief wrestling match on the turf, which he won. "Better hurry," he said, "or they'll put you in the guardhouse." We were walking again, faster. Bobby and Leper and Chet were urging us from ahead, for God's sake, to hurry up, and then Finney trapped me again in his strongest trap. That is, I suddenly became his collaborator. As we walked rapidly along, I abruptly resented the bell and my West Point stride and hurrying and conforming. Finney was right, and there was only one way to show him this. I threw my hip against his, catching him by surprise. He was instantly down, definitely pleased. This was why he liked me so much. When I jumped on top of him, my knees on his chest, he couldn't ask for anything better. We struggled in some equality for a while, and then when we were sure we were too late for dinner, we broke off. This here, probably a bit more related to another theme at some point. That will be revealed to us later, but something definitely to keep in mind. Perhaps this one over here might be an aha moment, as he abruptly resented the bell and his West Point stride and hurrying and conforming. He and I passed the gym and came on toward the first group of dormitories, which were dark and silent. There were only 200 of us at Devon in the summer, not enough to fill most of the school. We passed the sprawling headmaster's house, empty. He was doing something for the government in Washington. Past the chapel, empty again, used only for a short time in the mornings. Past the first academy building, the one we visited when he was 31, where there were some dim lights shining from a few of its many windows. Masters at work in their classrooms there, down a short slope into the broad and well-equipped common, on which light fell from the big surrounding Georgian buildings. A dozen boys were loafing there on the grass after dinner, and a kitchen rattle from the wing of one of the buildings accompanied their talk. The sky was darkening steadily, which brought up the lights in the dormitories and the old house. A loud phonograph a long way off played "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree," rejected that and played "They're Either Too Young or Too Old," grew more ambitious with the Warsaw Concerto, mellower with the Nutcracker Suite, and then stopped. Finney and I went to our room. Under the yellow steady lights, we read our hardy assignments. I was halfway through Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I'm not sure that's how you say it, but well. He carried on his baffled struggle with Far from the Madding Crowd, amused that there should be people named Gabriel Oak and Bathsheba Everdeen. Our legal radio, turned too low to be intelligible, was broadcasting the news. Outside, there was a rustling early summer movement of the wind. The seniors, allowed out later than we were, came fairly quietly back as the bells sounded 10 stately times. Boys ambled past our door toward the bathroom, and there was a period of steadily pouring shower water. Then lights began to snap out all over the school. We undressed, and I put on some pajamas, but Phineas, who heard they were unmilitary, didn't. Had heard they were unmilitary, didn't. There was a silence in which it was understood we were saying some prayers, and then that summer school day came to an end. Here we see a bit of a contrast here. We see a contrast because Phineas had heard that pajamas were unmilitary. So therefore, he would like something military. But he somewhat considers authority something to be reacted against, which is, let me rewrite this, which is a bit of a contrast, right there. Contrast. There was the silence in which it was understood we were saying some prayers, and that summer school day came to an end. Besides that, John Knowles, throughout this chapter, just seems to rely on a lot of imagery of the setting. Probably he's going to use the imagery to show contrast later, change the mood. He definitely uses imagery of the setting in this chapter to determine mood. So over here, going back through, leaving some plot notes. Over here, we have the jump from tree. Over here, we've revealed to us Phineas's position on authority. Over back here, not much over here. Mainly him just reminiscing on the school. And then at the end, them reading their books, not too much. Really, just one thing we note throughout this whole chapter, and I'll put this under the thing, under the chapter numbers here, thankfully they've left a bunch of space for me, is the scenery. Lots of imagery with the scenery for mood, most likely. Later it might lead to tone. How much time? We'll finish. Where does chapter 2 end? Let's see. Another 12 pages. We'll work through chapter 2, at least part of it. So, chapter 2. Our absence from dinner had been noticed. The following morning, the clean-washed shine of summer mornings in the North Country, Mr. Prudhomme stopped at our door. He was broad-shouldered, grave, and he wore a grey business suit. He did not have the careless, almost British look of most of the Devon masters, because he was a substitute for the summer. He enforced rules such as he knew. Missing dinner was one of them. We had been swimming in the river, Finney explained. There had been a wrestling match, then there was that sunset that anybody would want to watch, and there had been several friends we had to see on business. He rambled on, his voice soaring and plunging in its vibrant soundbox, his eyes now and then widening to fire a flash. Underline the introduction of Mr. Prudhomme there. Widening to fire a flash of green across the room. Standing in the shadows, with a bright window behind him, he blazed with sunburned health. As Mr. Prudhomme looked at him and listened to the scatterbrained eloquence of his explanation, there's an oxymoron there, he could be seen rapidly losing his grip on sternness. If you hadn't already missed 9 meals in the last 2 weeks, he broke in. So we've noticed that Phineas here, or Phineas and Jean, as he ropes Jean into it, seem to have a penchant for not doing what they're supposed to. He broke in. But Finney pressed his advantage, not because he wanted to be forgiven for missing the meal. That didn't interest him at all. He might have rather enjoyed the punishment if it was done in some novel and unknown way. He pressed his advantage because he saw that Mr. Prudhomme was pleased, won over in spite of himself. The master was slipping from his official position momentarily, and it was just possible, if Phineas pressed hard enough, that there might be a flow of simple, unregulated friendliness between them, and such flows were one of Phineas' reasons for living. Here we see more characterization. He's focused on harmony between people. So it's Phineas over here. Phineas focused on harmony. As well as novelty, I guess. Just sort of looking for new things. in his somewhat reckless manner. Or reckless. I guess we could start describing Phineas as reckless in the sense that he simply doesn't care about something. For example, that tree back there. That tree, he didn't think about the risks more than he thought about the novelty or the fun. So, continuing on. The real reason, sir, was that we just had to jump out of that tree. You know that tree. I knew. Mr. Poulon must have known. Finney knew if he stopped to think that jumping out of the tree was even more forbidden than missing a meal. We had to do that, naturally, he went on, because we're all getting ready for the war. What if they lower the draft age to 17? Jean and I are both going to be 17 at the end of the summer, which is a very convenient time since it's the start of the academic year, and there's never any doubt about which class you should be in. Lepellier is already 17, and if I'm not mistaken, he will be draftable before the end of his next academic year, and so conceivably he ought to have been in a class ahead. He ought to have been a senior now, if you see what I mean, so that he would have been graduated and been all set to be drafted. But we're all right. Jean and I are perfectly all right. There isn't any question that we are conforming in every possible way to everything that's happening and everything that's going to happen. It's all a question of birthdays, unless you want to be more specific and look at it from the sexual point of view, which I never cared to do myself, since it's a question of my mother and my father. I have never felt I wanted to think about their sexual lives too much. Everything he said was true and sincere. Finney always said what he happened to be thinking. And if this stunned people, then he was surprised. So there we see more characterization. As well as probably there's something relating to draft and whatnot there, but who knows. Characterization. Probably be a lot of characterization in these first few chapters, and then we start getting into the meat of the story. Mr. Proudhon released his breath with a sort of amazed laugh, stared at Finney for a while, and that was all there was to it. This was the way the masters tended to treat us that summer. They seemed to be modifying their usual attitude of floating, chronic disapproval. During the winter, most of them regarded anything unexpected in a student with suspicion, seeming to feel that anything we said or did was potentially illegal. Now, on these clear June days in New Hampshire, they appeared to uncoil. They seemed to believe that we were with them about half the time, and only spent the other half trying to make fools of them. A streak of tolerance was detectable. Finney decided that they were beginning to show commendable signs of maturity. It was partly his doing. The Devon faculty had never before experienced a student who had combined a calm ignorance of the rules with a winning urge to be good. He seemed to love the school truly and deeply, and never more than when he was breaking the regulations. A model boy who was most comfortable in the truant's corner. The faculty threw up its hands over Phineas, and so loosened its grip on all of us. And so there we see more characterization about Phineas, who just sort of in a paradox in and of himself. But there was another reason. I think we reminded them of what peace was like, we boys of 16. We were registered with no draft board, we had taken no physical examinations, no one had ever tested us for hernia or color blindness. Prick knees and punctured eardrums were minor complaints and not yet disabilities which would separate a few from the fate of the rest. We were careless and wild, and I suppose we could be thought of as a sign of the life the war was being fought to preserve. Anyway, they were more indulgent toward us than at any other time. They snapped at the heels of the seniors, driving and molding and arming them for the war. They noticed our games tolerantly. We reminded them of what peace was like, of lives which were not bound up with destruction. So here we note that the boys represent peace, at least to the Devon faculty, which, given that this is a book about the loss of innocence, probably will mean something later on. Phineas was the essence of this careless peace. Not that he was unconcerned about the war. After Mr. Proudhon left, he began to dress. That is, he began reaching for whatever clothes were nearest, of the mine. Then he stopped to consider, and went over to the dresser. Out of one of the drawers he lifted a finely woven broadcloth shirt, carefully cut and very pink. "What is that thing?" "This is a tablecloth," he said out of the side of his mouth. "No, cut it out. What is it?" "This," he answered with some pride, "is going to be my emblem. Ma sent it up last week. Did you ever see stuff like this, and a color like this? It doesn't even button all the way down. You have to pull it over your head, like this." "Over your head? Pink. It makes you look like a fairy." "Does it?" He used this preoccupied tone when he was thinking of something more interesting than what you had said. But his mind always recorded what was said and played it back to him when there was time. So as he was buttoning the high collar in front of the mirror, he said mildly, "I wonder what would happen if I looked like a fairy to everyone." "You're nuts." "Well, in case suitors begin clamoring at the door, you can tell them I'm wearing this as an emblem." He turned around to let me admire it. "I was reading in the paper that we bombed Central Europe for the first time the other day." Only someone who knew Phineas as well as I did could realize that he was not changing the subject. I waited quietly for him to make whatever fantastic connection there might be between this and the shirt. "Well, we've got to do something to celebrate. We haven't got a flag. We can't float Old Glory proudly out the window, so I'm going to wear this as an emblem." He did wear it. No one else in the school could have done so without some risk of having it torn from his back. When the sternest of the summer session masters, old Mr. Patch Withers, came up to him after history class and asked him about it, I watched his drawn but pink face become bigger with amusement as Finney politely explained the meaning of the shirt. So, more characterization of Phineas, and probably, if that pink shirt reoccurs, we might want to take more notice of it. It was hypnotism. I was beginning to see that Phineas could get away with everything. I couldn't help envying him that a little, which was perfectly normal. There was no harm in envying even your best friend a little. In the afternoon, Mr. Patch Withers, who was substitute headmaster for the summer, offered the traditional term tea to the upper middle class. It was held in the deserted headmaster's house, and Mr. Patch Withers' wife trembled at every cup tinkle. We were in a kind of sun porch and conservatory combined, spacious and damp and without many plants. Those there were had large, non-flowering stalks with big, barbaric leaves. The chocolate brown wicker furniture shot out menacing twigs, and 3 dozen of us stood tensely teetering our cups amid the wicker and leaves, trying hard not to sound as inane in our conversation with the 4 present masters and their wives as they sounded to us. Phineas had soaked and brushed his hair for the occasion. This gave his head a sleek look, which was contradicted by the surprised, honest expression which he wore on his face. His ears, I had never noticed before, were fairly small and set close to his head, and combined with his plastered hair, they now gave his bold nose and cheekbones the sharp look of proud. This over here, his ears I had never noticed before. We know Phineas is Jean's best friend, so most likely this is just showing that there's always something new about Phineas. He's one of those people who you're always discovering something new about. He alone talked easily. He discussed the bombing of Central Europe. No one else happened to have seen the story, and since Phineas could not recall exactly which target in which country had been hit, or whether it was the American, British, or even Russian Air Force which had hit it, or what day he read it in which newspaper, the discussion was one-sided. That didn't matter. It was the event which counted. But after a while, Finney felt he should carry the discussion to others. "I think we ought to bomb the daylights out of them, as long as we don't hit any women or children or old people, don't you?" he was saying to Mrs. Patch Withers, perched nervously behind her urn. "Or hospitals," he went on, "and naturally no schools or churches. We must also be careful about works of art," she put in, "if they are of permanent value." "A lot of nonsense," Mr. Patch Withers grumbled, with a flushed face. "How do you expect our boys to be as precise as that, thousands of feet up, with bombs weighing tons? Look at what the Germans did to Amsterdam. Look at what they did to Coventry." "The Germans aren't the Central Europeans, dear," his wife said, being gently. And here we start to see some anti-Germanic feeling within the U.S. He didn't like being brought up short, but he seemed to be just able to bear it from his wife. After a temperamental pause, he said gruffly, "There isn't any permanent art in Central Europe anyway. They're probably forgetting all the pretty cathedrals in there." Finney was enjoying this. He unbuttoned his seersucker jacket, as though he needed greater body freedom for the discussion. Mr. Patch Withers' glance then happened to fall on his belt. In a tentative voice she said, "Isn't that the R?" Her husband looked. I panicked. In his haste that morning, Finney had not unexpectedly used a tie for the belt, but this morning the first tie at hand had been the Devon school tie. This time he wasn't going to get away with it. I could feel myself becoming unexpectedly excited at that. Mr. Patchwither's face was reaching a brilliant shade, and his wife's head fell as though before the guillotine. Even Finney seemed to color a little, unless it was the reflection from his pink shirt. But his expression was composed, and he said in his resonant voice, "I wore this, you see, because it goes with the shirt, and it all ties in together. I didn't mean that to be a pun. I don't think they're very funny, especially in polite company, do you? It all ties in together with what we've been talking about. This bombing in Central Europe, because when you come right down to it, the school is involved in everything that happens in the war. It's all the same war in the same world, and I think Devon ought to be included. I don't know whether you think the way I do on that." So here we see that Phineas is really great at talking his way out of certain situations. Either that or he planned it and Jean didn't notice it. So Phineas can get out of situations. Trouble. Besides that, we haven't left a lot of annotations for a few pages, so we'll go back here. We see more. Let's see here. Over here we see Phineas joking around. And then Phineas being the essence of a careless beast. That's probably going to be important later. And then Phineas over here, not changing the subject. You can tie anything in. And just being a bit eccentric. He could get away with anything. Phineas, always something new. But he also is always a bit considerate, as we can see from him not wanting to, as he wants to bomb the daylights out of them, but not hit anything such as women or children or old people or hospitals or schools or churches or and then Mr. Patchwithers is a bit older and jaded and realistic. Anti-German sentiment over here. And the no permanent art, I suppose, is a bit mean to the Hungarians if you consider them part of Central Europe. Then again, the Hungarians were part of the Axis, so. So over here. So, back to the tie. Notice how Phineas can tie everything together. Mr. Patchwither's face had been shifting expressions and changing colors continuously. And now it settled into fixed surprise. I never heard anything so illogical as that in my life. He didn't sound very indignant, though. That's probably the strangest tribute the school has had in 160 years. He seemed pleased or amused in some unknown corner of his mind. Phineas was going to get away with even this. His eyes gave their wider, magical gleam, and his voice continued on a more compelling level. Although I have to admit, I didn't think of that when I put it on this morning. He smiled pleasantly after supplying this interesting additional information. Mr. Patchwither settled into a hearty silence as this, and Finney added, "I'm glad I'm put on something for a belt. I certainly would hate the embarrassment of having my pants fall down at the headmaster's tea. Of course he isn't here, but it would be just as embarrassing in front of you and Mrs. Patchwithers." And he smiled politely down at her. So he just has the voice where he can really just make anybody accept that. So he's honest, for one. He doesn't try to hide that he didn't think of that when he put it on this morning. but he's also always pleasant. And then throughout this, we notice that his voice is Phineas's voice is continually, again and again, shown as being very compelling. So that's probably one of the main motifs or particular ideas that reoccurs. Mr. Patchwither's laughter surprised us all, including himself. His face, whose shades we have often labeled, now achieved a new one. Phineas was very happy. Sour and stern Mr. Patchwithers had been given a good laugh for once, and he had done it. He broke into the charmed, thoughtless grin of a man fulfilled. So Phineas, again, lives for others' happiness. It's probably one of those personality types or something or another. He had gotten away with everything. I felt a sudden stab of disappointment. That was because I just wanted to see some more excitement. That must have been it. And here we can tell, because of the way it's said, that that's probably not it. Jing is probably not only a bit jealous of Phineas, but something, just the difference in their personalities, is probably going to lead to some sort of conflict between them. We left the party, both of us feeling fine. I laughed along with Finny, my best friend, and also unique, able to get away with anything at all, and not because he was Kniver either, I was sure of that. He got away with everything because of the extraordinary kind of person he was. It was quite a compliment to me, as a matter of fact, to have such a person choose me for his best friend. Finny never left anything alone, not when it was well enough, not when it was perfect. "Let's go jump in the river," he said under his breath as we went out of the sun porch. He forced compliance by leaning against me as we walked along, changing my direction like a police car squeezing me to the side of the road. He directed me unwillingly toward the gym and the river. "We need to clear our heads of all that party," he said, "all that talk." And you remember how Phineas dislikes authority, and yet he's being compared here to a police car? Probably a bit of contrast in there too. Him forcing compliance, yet he dislikes authority. What this probably reveals is he dislikes, in the sense of just the monolithic authority around him, because it doesn't exist in the way he sees to bring happiness to other people. He probably sees authority as its only purpose is to bring happiness to people, which is how he lives, such as over here, bringing Mr. Patchwithers a laugh. Yes, I'm sure it was boring. Who did most of the talking anyway? Finny concentrated. Mr. Patchwithers was pretty gassy, and his wife, and turning a look of mock shock on me, he said, mock shock on me. "You don't mean to infer that I talk too much?" Returning with interest his gaping shock. "You talk too much? How can you accuse me of accusing you of that?" As I said, this was my sarcastic summer. It was only long after that I realized sarcasm as the protest of people who are weak. We walked along, and that's probably, right there, something the author feels himself. Author seeping through, doesn't like sarcasm. We walked along through the shining afternoon to the river. "I don't really believe we bombed Central Europe, do you?" said Finny thoughtfully. The dormitories we passed were massive and almost anonymous behind their thick layers of ivy, big, old-looking leaves you would have thought stayed there winter and summer, permanent hanging gardens in New Hampshire. Between the buildings, elms curved so high that you ceased to remember their familiar trunks and the lowest umbrellas of leaves, and took in the lofty complex they held above, branches and branches of branches. A world of branches with an infinity of leaves. They seemed permanent and never-changing, like an untouched, unreachable world in high space, like the ornamental towers and spires of a great church, too high to be enjoyed, too high for anything, great and remote and never useful. So here we see not only him noting that it seems permanent and never-changing, which we know in the introduction he later recants, but that Gene himself is a much more practical person. Would rather something be useful than great and remote and never useful. So Gene, over here, practical. Which is probably part of why he's a bit of an opposition to Phineas. Because Phineas to Gene seems more of a carefree, more out there person that doesn't care more for that practicality, that usefulness, as Gene doesn't necessarily see happiness and emotions as useful. Which, if I had space, I should probably write that down, but I'm a little bit too lazy for that. Although, here we go. Sarcasm at the protest of people who are weak. That's probably author, right there. No, I don't think I believe it either, I answered. Far ahead of us, 4 boys, looking like white flags on endless green playing fields, crossed toward the tennis courts. To the right of them, the gym meditated behind its gray walls, the high, wide, oval-topped windows shining back at the sun. Excuse me. Beyond the gym and the fields began the woods, or the Devon School woods, which in my imagination were the beginning of the great northern forests. I thought that from the Devon woods, trees reached an unbroken, widening corridor so far to the north that no one had ever seen the other end, somewhere up in the far unorganized tips of Canada. We seemed to be playing on the tame fringe of the last and greatest wilderness. I never found out whether this is so, and perhaps it is. Seemed to be playing on the tame fringe of the last and greatest wilderness, such as the edge of adolescence right before adulthood. Right. Bombs in Central Europe were completely unreal to us here, not because we couldn't imagine it. 1,000 newspaper photographs and newsreels had given us a pretty accurate idea of such a sight, but because our place here was too fair for us to accept something like that. We spent that summer in complete selfishness, I'm happy to say. The people in the world who could be selfish in the summer of 1942 were a small band, and I'm glad we took advantage of it. The first person who says anything unpleasant will get a swift kick in the ass, said Fanny reflectively as we came to the river. All right. Are you still afraid to jump out of the tree? There's something unpleasant about that question, isn't there? That question? No, of course not. It depends on how you answer it. Afraid to jump out of that tree? I expect it'll be a very pleasant jump. After we had swum around in the water for a while, Fanny said, Will you do me the pleasure of jumping out of the tree first? My pleasure. Rigid, I began climbing the rungs, slightly reassured by having Finney right beside me. We'll jump together to cement our partnership, he said. We'll form a suicide society, and the membership requirement is 1 jump out of the tree. A suicide society, I said stiffly. The Suicide Society of the Summer Session. Good, the Super Suicide Society of the Summer Session. How's that? That's fine. That's okay. This is probably going to be referenced later. But also shows the innocence of Gene and Finney towards death. And his stance on that will most likely change by the end of the book. We were standing on a limb, I a little farther out than Finney. I turned to say something else, some stalling remark, something to delay even a few seconds more, and then I realized in turning I had begun to lose my balance. I realized that there was a moment of total impersonal panic, and then Finney's hand shot out and grabbed my arm, and with my balance restored, the panic immediately disappeared. And this probably represents something. He turned, lost his balance, and then Finney saved him. And once the balance was restored, the panic immediately disappeared. There's probably a bit of symbolism that will come later in that. I turned back toward the river, moved a few more steps along the limb, sprang far out, and fell into the deep water. Finney also made a good jump, and the Super Suicide Society of the Summer Session was officially established. It was only after dinner, when I was on my way alone to the library, that the full danger I had brushed on the limb shook me again. If Finney hadn't come up right behind me, if he hadn't been there, I could have fallen on the bank and broken my back. If I had fallen awkwardly enough, I could have been killed. Finney had practically saved my life. So here we see Finney saves Jean. And then at the front of the book, we'll notice that throughout this book, bombs in Central Europe, and Finney getting out of trouble. And just some more characterization. And speaking of that, the first one, mainly characterization. Scenery, imagery for mood, flashback, intro, and /theme introduction. While over here, it's more mood of relaxation, whatnot. And so that's probably where we're going to stop today. Thank y'all who showed up to watch. I don't think anything else to note right now. Depending on what I find out later, we might go back through this in the next session. The next session will be at the same time, 11 a.m. on Friday, this Friday, the 18th, it should be. I hope to see you then. Call your friends, show up, more viewers, etc. Be happy to have you. Anyways, I think that will be it for today's read aloud of A Separate Piece by John Knowles. I hope y'all enjoyed. I know I did. Quite an interesting book, that's for one. So, I'll see y'all on Friday.